So welcome everyone to STR's Meet the Scholar sessions. My name is Samina Karim, I'm the STR Division Chair, and we decided to start with a bang, and we said, who is the first scholar we want to highlight in our Meet the Scholar series? And we couldn't go wrong with Gerry George. So I want to give you a quick introduction of Gerry. So Gerry, let's see if this is going to cooperate with me. There we go. All right, Gerry is the Dean of the Lee Kong Shan School of Business at Singapore Management University, where he has been since 2015. He is also the Lee Kong Shan Chaired Professor of Innovation and Entrepreneurship. Previously, he held tenured positions at Imperial College London, London Business School, and the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He has a PhD in management from Virginia Commonwealth University. He served as AMJ editor from 2013 to 2016. And while there, he encouraged scholars to go beyond theory development and also to focus on phenomenon and to improve applicability of management research. Various awards and recognitions, I could not include them all on this PowerPoint. So a few that I'd like to highlight. He was named as the Innovation Fellow of the Advanced Institute of Management Research, awarded a prestigious professorial fellowship by UK's Economic and Social Research Council, and is a fellow of both the City and Guilds of London Institute and also the Royal Society of Arts, Manufacturers, and Commerce. He helped be part of the SMS Program Committee for 2008 in the special conference that was held in Hyderabad. He serves on the board of AACSB International now, which is one of our main accreditation bodies. In 2017, he was tasked with redrafting the Corporate Governance Code of Singapore by the Council of the Monetary Authority of Singapore. He served on various committees and organizations in Singapore and India, influencing entrepreneurship and social impact in both regions. He's written or edited 5 books, published over 100 articles, has over 30,000 citations, and his research is primarily on internationalization and entrepreneurship, business models and open innovation, sustainability, and tackling grand challenges, including those of the United Nations Sustainability Development Goals. So please join me in welcoming Gerry George.
Right. Thank you. Thanks, Amina. Before you go further, I just wanted to say thank you for having me as just a sharing session today. One of the things that I did say to you is that I'm not prepared, or I'm not preparing anything, so you just have a casual conversation about these. There are a lot of friends here who are joining here who've had far more impact than I have. So from that perspective, at least, let me say thank you to those who've joined, and I look forward to having a great conversation. So thanks to your colleagues for arranging it.
Thank you, Gerry, for joining us. So this is my first time meeting you. And so I have so many questions. And so one of the things we wanted to achieve with Meet the Scholar is we're certainly going to talk about your scholarship, but we wanted to learn about the scholar more holistically. Where you grew up, the influences you had in your life, the choices you had to make through your career. So maybe we could start first with, if you could tell us a little bit about where you grew up and people that were influential in your life when you were younger.
So I grew up in a city called Chennai, Madras, in India. I went to school in a Catholic school, Don Bosco. So got good Catholic Salesian education. And then from there, I went to BITS, it's called in North India, a place called Rajasthan, Birla Institute of Technology and Science, one of India's premier tech engineering sort of universities. And so that's my India story. And I have to tell you, I come from a very entrepreneurial family. I think one of my big inspirations, I'd have to say, is my mom, who started putting that entrepreneurship spirit in me. Perhaps when I was in my 10th standard, or year 10, right, as in school. So my mom and I started this tanker business. Tankers, as in these big lorries that carry water from one place to the other. And the reason we did that was because Chennai at that time had a big water problem, and it did again last year, where the city ran out of drinking water. So we started off with one truck, and then by the time I finished year 12, we had 16 trucks, and then we sold all those trucks. I used to manage the night shift. My mom used to manage the day shift. So I'd work with truckers to coming in at night to give them sort of their charge sheets of where they have to go and things like that. And then in the morning, then they'll come back with cash, and my mom picks up the cash. And so that's how we started that. So then, of course, and the reason for all of this was perhaps a difficulty in our family. My dad was an entrepreneur as well, but then he fell sick. So we had this, he had this huge, what you'd say, pressure vessels business for power turbines and things like that in building all of these pressure vessels. So big engineering kind of business. But then he had a heart attack and sort of he fell poorly after that. So we lost that business, right? And then so sort of it became a necessity to do something. And then we tried these things. And then since then, I've been dabbling in entrepreneurship. So I guess my first inspiration for entrepreneurship comes from family, whether it's my dad, my mom, or certainly necessity, right? So since then, we've been quite entrepreneurial uh, in trying out new things.
And did any of is that business still part of the family, or did any siblings partake in that as well? Or
No, we've gone from other businesses after that. So then we entered real estate in the family business, and then my dad again started, these air conditioning, like in Dubai. These they put air conditioning and electricity maintenance for these big buildings, right? And so you maintain like the airports and so forth. These fellows cleaning the airports all the time. So my dad started that business, 20 years ago. So my brother still continues that business, and it's grown terrifically in Dubai. So now he's doing well for himself. Yes.
so I have to ask you this, being from South Asia as well. So there's the joke that your parents say you have to be an engineer, doctor, or a lawyer. And
Yeah.
so you mentioned you studied engineering. Was that was that something you definitely wanted to do and you knew that you wanted to do from the beginning?
No, this works slightly differently. In Pilani, what happened was I wanted to study engineering. Um, I got engineering in another college in Chennai, another tech institute. But what happened was that I didn't want to stay close to home, so I went as farthest away as possibly one could possibly do within India. So I went to the north, the farthest end, a little more, and you'll be in Pakistan, kind of as far as you could go. Um, and in particular in BITS, you get allotted based on your score, whatever program you get into. So I got into life sciences, then I took a second degree in management. So I've got two master's degrees, integrated masters. One was um, life sciences, biological sciences, and the other one was management studies.
See, all right. So you had a touch of management in well before the PhD program and getting into what we do now, sounds
Yeah.
like.
Yeah.
So, I love one of the questions that I have to give a shout out here to Rich McAdock, because he also has a series that he's begun interviewing strategy scholars, and it's wonderful. And something that Rich does when he has folks out at Purdue is he asks them, when most 10-year-olds don't say, I want to grow up and be a strategic management scholar. And so the question is, how did you end up thinking even of doing a PhD? And so from that management master's, what were you doing next that then eventually led you into a doctoral program?
I have to say, BITS Pilani, the university that I went to, they're, I think, the largest exporter of talent from India, right? So all my, so I was thinking I'll join the family business, but all my wingmates in the hostel, right, in the dorms, one of my wingmates said, I'm going to take the GRE. I want somebody to study with me. So that's pretty much it. There was no rational reason for why I took it. So I just took it because he couldn't study by himself. So he wanted me to study with him. That's it. And then when he applied, whichever school he applied to, he also made me apply. So, and that's it. There was no logical choice to this. But I went into work for AT&T in their first, as part of the training in in university, you've got a practice school, sort of like an internship. So I went with AT&T, and then after that, I was offered this opportunity to continue. And then AT&T had this office in Richmond, Virginia. And it started off with, oh, maybe I'll go to AT&T in Richmond, Virginia. But then at that time, the AT&T went through a reorg. And so they said, oh, sorry, we can't take you. But um, by that time, I was in this city called Richmond, Virginia, and I could see the campus of the university, which is VCU. So when I was applying, I got into different schools. Had the choice of Carnegie Mellon or Indiana or VCU, which was right next door. So I chose the lazy route and just went to VCU because I could walk from where I was to the university. That's it.
Wow. I hope you're still friends with that friend who had such an impact on your life.
Yes, in fact, I am.
Now, when you entered the program at VCU, did you have a family with you, or were you a solo bachelor at the time?
I was a bachelor. In fact, I was very young. I was 24 at that time. So my parents, very traditional, very conservative Catholics, they thought that if I stayed in the U.S. longer, that I would be tempted to marry a Caucasian woman, and therefore they said you should get married right away. So they fixed an arranged marriage. They called me, I remember clearly, May 16th, and they said, "You're gonna, we've seen this girl for you. You're gonna get married. What do you think?" I was fine. Yeah, she's smart, good looking, all of these things, and so then I flew back to India. In June 2nd, I got legally married. Uh, the After the first year of my PhD program, then Hema came back with me in August. We had a church wedding in August, and we had like 1,500 people for the wedding, and then came back. We got married 24th of August. Poor thing flew back with me on the 29th of August because I could start, I think university started the first week of September or something along those lines. So first year, got married. Second year, had my first daughter. So that really forced me because I was really poor. And and I didn't have the thing to ask my parents for more money. So we just managed by what we did. So that forced me to do the doctoral program sooner. So I finished my PhD in 2.5 years.
Wow.
And then and then I said, okay, now get a job. So nothing sharper to focus your mind than having a family restriction or things that sort of force you to do it.
Right. Financial necessity, right? And
Necessity, yes, yeah.
well, so I'm sure I love that you remember May 16th. So I'm sure you tell your wife that was the best day of your life.
Not quite, not quite. And in fact, so August 24th this year is our 25th wedding anniversary. So I'm here in Singapore, she's in London. So I'm trying to get permission from the Singapore government to go to London and come back. So we'll see if that happens.
That's wonderful. Wonderful. So you said you did your PhD in 2.5 years. I'm sure there are a lot of doctoral students on this Zoom call who are wondering, oh my goodness, it took me 2+ years just to learn about what's been researched in the field, let alone to try to narrow a research question and to figure out what my dissertation should be. So can you tell us a little bit about how you even thought about the ideas that were interesting to you, and then what you thought might be a contribution, and ultimately what was your dissertation about?
I think sometimes we think too much about what that contribution is and so forth, right? Um, and also at that time, you see my peers weren't all thinking about publishing an AMJ, right? So it really makes a difference on who you study with, right? And the peer effects there. My peers were thinking about going into local universities in Virginia, and so at that time, I thought, wow, my dream job at the end of my career, I should be at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, right? Because at that time, starting from VCU, nobody, when I told them, hey, I think I want to go to UNC as my dream job, people turn to me and think nobody's ever gone from VCU to UNC. So you see, for that was aspirational at that time. So it all sort of changes over time, right? So my peers at that time were thinking that if you finish fast, you can join another 4-year college and start from there, which is exactly what I did. I joined the University of Richmond, which is a private university, a very good university, as a visiting assistant professor there. And because I graduated through the mid-year, so I just joined there and I started teaching there. And then a year later, I moved to Syracuse. Right.
Okay. So we have
Yeah.
a connection. I grew up in Syracuse, New York. So all I remember is snow, snow, and more snow of my childhood. So
I think it's still the same. It was quite dumpy at that time. I'm sure it's improved.
it's improved. So, so Gerry, what was your dissertation research question? And
Um, but I did my life sciences and management together, right? So at that time, this was 94, 95. And I said networks and competence in biotech industry, right? So how do firms collaborate for innovation essentially at that time? So at that time, networks and innovation was an interesting concept. Um, uh, this is, yeah, 20 plus years ago, 24 years ago. So, and there was this, there were these papers on Powell's work and so forth on innovation. And I started thinking along those lines, right? And so in my thesis, I looked at one of the things that I did was university industry partnerships in biotech firms, biotech innovation. And so I got that paper published, Journal of Business Venturing. I sent it to JBV at that time. It got accepted. Interesting time there. They were going through the journal, used to do paper sort of reviews, right? You'd print out 3 copies of those papers, send it in, and then they'll circulate the papers by post. Then the decision letter will arrive by post and so forth. So what happened was they had accepted my paper, then they lost the final version of my paper that I submitted. So 2 years later, I wrote to them and said, boss, you accepted this paper in like 2000 or 98, 99, something like that. What happened? And then they search for it and they say, oh, sorry, we completely missed it. And then they published in 2002 after that. So you see, you never know how these things happen, but it, it just worked. So JBV was my thesis paper, got that out. And then because I came from a place where I didn't have any data, but I could write reasonably well, and I still think I've got reasonably strong conceptual skills. So I started writing these AMR papers. On there was a special issue on privatization, so I talked about emerging economies and so forth, privatization in emerging economies. And then in a conference in about year 2000, or maybe a bit earlier, I was sitting at the because I took Hema, my wife, we and my daughter. By that time, Vivian was born. We had gone for this conference, and we were sitting at the back because Hema wanted to go for a tour and things. It was in San Francisco, and the last table of the conference, where Shakar Zara, Michael Head, Dwayne Ireland, all of them were sitting because they didn't want to sit in the front. So I was sitting there and I was thinking, hey, I've heard all of your papers, and I was talking to them, and he says, oh, and Shakar introduced himself. He says, and there was another person called Dan Jennings. He had written this paper in entrepreneurship some time ago. And he says, I told him I expected Shakar to, in our mind, we conceive who these scholars are, right? Whether they write long papers or short papers and so forth. And I said, Shakar, I had expected you to be writing those long, boring papers, but it turns out that it's the other person. And then Shakar got this whole kick out of it. And he says, oh, maybe we should write together. Maybe we'll tell something. And that's how the absorptive capacity paper started. So we were brainstorming on innovation, and then we came up with that review paper. And that paper, now if I've got 30,000 cites, that paper has at least 10,000 cites. So it's a third of my citations uh, from that one conversation sitting at the back of that conference.
So you touched upon something I wanted to ask you, which was, you mentioned your dissertation was on networks and in the biotech industry, and then many of your papers that are very influential are with Shakar Zara, and especially this absorptive capacity one. So then how did your research evolve? Because you also mentioned you've done a lot of work in privatization and entrepreneurship in international areas and developing countries. So how did that trajectory happen?
I don't think I really had a strategy for all of this, right? I was quite opportunistic in what topics I'd pick. I knew emerging economies, so I wrote some papers on that. And then it took me into sort of this international entrepreneurship type of space and so on. Then I was doing work on innovation, so that continued as a pathway, right? So I don't think we had. Um, I said, oh, I will not do papers in specific areas because beggars can't be choosers. I started off from VCU. I was not in a place that had massive data sets. I don't even think we had access to all of these fancy data that people now can download and run regressions till the cows come home. But I couldn't do any of those things, right? So you had to write conceptual papers. So I think in a matter of 3-4 years, I think I wrote about 4 or 5 AMRs. And that got me started in sort of the space, and then I started adding papers with data. We started collecting data and so forth. So that's it.
So when, my kids sometimes ask me this, and so I'm going to ask you the question. What would you like to be remembered for as your contribution from your scholarship? Because you have over 100 papers and so many citations. If you had to pick kind of the biggest theme of what you would like to be remembered for in your work, what would that be?
So if anything, I'd like to be remembered for management theories or with social impact, right? But actually, we don't choose how we are remembered by. So, most people would think of the absorptive capacity paper. Nowadays, a lot of people ask me about grand challenges, which I really appreciate. But it's not a choice; it's a journey. In fact, the AMJ, if you think of pivotal points in my life, the becoming AMJ editor, associate editor first, and then editor was a turning point because I've never had this theoretical lens that I swore by, right? I just always picked phenomena that were interesting. So being an AMJ editor actually made me think about why is our field so obsessed with theoretical continuity rather than trying to explain important and relevant phenomena. And it also came at a point where a lot of people, including Anita, Costas, at LBS, we had this workshop on, I'm sure Costas can tell more, on relevance based on Sumantra Ghoshal's work and so forth. And so that it's a combination of where you are at that time. I was at London Business School, and this importance of managerial relevance, and my own background, the dependencies of where we go through. I wrote AMR papers, but I wasn't wedded to a particular theoretical focus, right? So you just go from there, and that AMJ experience was very pivotal for me, because then I started writing with several collaborators these editorials, um, so if you look through our AMJ editorials at that time, we had written for example, managing for resilience. Now we talk about resilience as though we've never heard of it before, but we've had these sort of different instances where we've done all of this, right? Whether it was climate change, whether it was different topics like this, we've written editorials on that. Another stream that sort of pivotal time, one was AMJ, which transformed the way I was thinking. But if I go back a little bit further, was me going from LBS to Imperial. And in Imperial I went from London Business School to Imperial College. At Imperial, it was much more interdisciplinary, right? LBS is a single school, it's a business school, it's a standalone entity. So all the conversations we were having were about business. But when I went to Imperial, all the conversations were about what difference you're going to make and whether you're uh, sort of discovering a drug. You had this interactions with Nobel Prize winners in physics, in biochemistry, and they all had a very different approach. View to life as saying, "Oh, we are here to solve practical problems." So you see, it sort of became ingrained, that exposure of interdisciplinary work. It's of trying to be useful in society and so forth, right? So at that time, one of the projects we started was this rural electrification in Africa. And we put a big grant for that. And my collaborator was in University of Southampton, engineering professor, civil engineering professor. And then we said we created Energy for Development, and that was in 2009-10, around that time. And we said we'll electrify rural communities. And then there was no research question at that time that sort of I wasn't thinking, what can we write about rural electrification and management theory? Doesn't relate at all. So we say, oh wow, rural electrification, and it started with a simple phenomenon that, in rural East Africa, less than 5% of the households were electrified. And then you'd sort of ask, why is that the case? And when you start asking why, what can you do about it? Then you come to a different place. And so we created this team. We started implementing rural electrification projects, solar projects in different villages. We did these, what we now post-hoc called field experiments. And then I wrote this SMJ paper on entrepreneurship in Africa. But but it didn't start with entrepreneurship. It started with rural electrification, and then it slowly progressed. So what Imperial really taught me was that the importance of interdisciplinary work, the importance of asking big questions, and then trying to solve problems for society. And along the way, folks like Costas were inspirations. Then I saw Anita, met Anita. We started working together. We wrote this paper on inclusive innovation in 2011 or 12, I think. Right. So it's sort of how it's the peer effect of people who want to make a difference, and then you sort of it happens. I'm sure Anita, I'm going to ask you a question. What did you think?
About the paper, the experience of the paper, or what you're saying generally?
No, about the paper. Don't comment on what I'm saying generally. You can do that in private.
Well, you know, I think there still is to this day tremendous kind of pent-up energy in the field to engage with these issues of global significance. And Gerry, that paper which you led us in writing was, you know, sort of just tapped into a bit of that energy. Can I also say that it's just wonderful to hear you talk about your story, and many of us who know you well, who are on this call, including Costas, who you mentioned, and others, will testify that Gerry is a person of enormous energy and excitement and positive affect, and he's always, the question with Gerry is whether or not something is awesome or super awesome, right?
So I pay Anita to say these things. Don't take me for Thank you, Anita.
And
Very kind of you. Very kind of
that
you.
positive excitement and energy and commitment to friendship first, and commitment to us as people really, I think, made that paper, came through that paper, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
So you see, I've had it's not a choice. It's sort of, it wasn't very rational in my thinking. All of these sort of happened over time, and you sort of co-evolved with what happens with the friends that you sort of grow up with in some ways, right? So um, then I was at Imperial. I was AMJ editor. I'd just become editor, and I was deputy dean at that time at Imperial. So I was handling all programs and so forth, and the growth in that business school. And then, you know, the provost from SMU came with the chair of the advisory board, and he flew to London, and he said, you know, we are looking for somebody looking for a dean. And I said, well, I'm just become editor of AMJ. I'm really not into becoming dean. But he said, why don't you just come and see Singapore? Then, okay, flew 2 weeks later, I flew here. Hema loved Singapore, right? And then we also have sort of aging parents and all of those issues that go with folks in my cohort, right? And so we have so Hema's parents and my parents were all in India. So we said, oh, being near Singapore can help us think through this particular phase where we spend a few more years more closer to them. And so for Hema, it was very important. Her dad passed away a few years ago, 2-3 years ago. So it allowed that connection and continuity with them, because we were in the US and the UK. Is not the same as being close to them. So the advantage of Singapore was she could take a flight at 7 in the morning, and given the time difference, it's a 3.5 hour flight. She'll be there for breakfast at her house at 8 o'clock. So she'd go and then spend like 2-3 days, and then come back for the weekend here. So when I travel during the week, I come back in the weekend. So we are always together that way, right? So it worked out very well from that perspective. And of course, professionally, SMU is at that time an institution which was trying to figure out, oh, we want to grow, we want to do well. And so my job, when they described it to me, is to get us ranked and visible in the world. We started doing very well in terms of growing our programs. So when you become dean, you sort of put the scholarly hat on one side. Somehow you have to compartmentalize this, and then you focus on building programs and hiring faculty and supporting faculty and all the people who are here. I'm sure they sometimes appreciate their deans, but it's difficult work. It's difficult work, and somebody has to do it. So if any of you are inspired to be dean, I would certainly say we need great academics to be even better dean, right? So I would certainly encourage that. No point in complaining about your dean if you won't step up.
Good, well phrased. I like that, Gerry. Before I ask you, actually, I have some questions about being dean and at SMU. I wanted to go back to kind of what you would advise or suggest that junior scholars study. So it seems like a lot of what you said is, you didn't have a straight path or a plan exactly for what you were going to do, but that you seem very social mission driven, and some of the phenomenon and problems that you wanted to address. So if you could speak to the junior scholars who are on this call or who will be listening later because this is recorded, what are the challenges? You mentioned some of the grand challenges, and I know you've done some work with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Which grand challenges would you like to see junior scholars pursue?
So my approach, I would not recommend, I would never recommend junior scholars to pick one grand challenge and go after it or something along those lines. What I would say is for them to think really hard about why they're doing their PhD, right? And if social impact is part of it, then to start thinking about a stream of research that connects where they have some background in to how you would then be useful in society in framing different questions or helping or enabling organizations to do that. And in that process, develop a research theme or a stream that comes about it. I'll give you an example. I wasn't really a rural electrification expert. In fact, I didn't even know whatever power, how you do this in battery powers and solar and so forth. But what I did know is how can you think about micro entrepreneurs, and how could you think about new business models? So when I was listening to the framing of the problem was that the UK government spends over £100 million a year on rural electrification projects. And then I just asked the question, um, how successful are they after they leave? Because I did know that many um, sort of these projects, development projects, people enter, do stuff, then they leave, and then it falls apart. So when I asked that question, they didn't have the answer to it. The minister at that time didn't have the answer to it. So afterwards, you had these conversations, and then they came out with this call that sort of says, okay, we don't have the answer to it, but how can we create business models for success so that you can replicate these business models across different communities? And so I was working on entrepreneurship, on business models. Then we connected with the engineering guys and say, hey, maybe there's something here that we can do, right? And how do you solve this big problem? And I think it's that inquisitiveness based on your own lens of the world, and to see problems and say, is there a way where we can be opportunistic in how we collaborate, but that allows you to build on your strengths? So for a junior scholar, I would always start with, where do you think your strengths are and where do you think your passion lies? And then from there, you start and start asking questions, not from a theoretical perspective, because not once did I go back and look at what theory was there on this. Instead, you sort of ask what was important to be done, what was the outcome, what does performance mean, and then work backwards and say, what are the pieces that are missing within this? And then we first wrote this review piece on business models in rural electrification. And so when we did this review, we understood that replication was a problem, scalability was a problem. And then you sort of internalize these and said, okay, now how can we build solutions that are replicable and scalable? And then you start going into what we theoretically call org design issues, we can call governance issues, and so forth, right? But then you start with the phenomenon and say, why can't we electrify villages more efficiently? And why can't we recreate this in different communities and make it succeed? So we came across challenges of ownership. We have fancy titles for this in theory, but if you give it to one entrepreneur in a village, the entrepreneur becomes arrogant and starts charging lots of money, right? So then it falls apart, and then there's a lot of politics behind it. Now, if you then give it in another format, in a sort of um, like a business, create a business and then do it yourself, that means then you're engaged throughout. So in other words, you're trying to play in the community's life for a longer period of time, which you don't want to be, because academics' attention is like a gnat, right? So we lose interest after a year, but it's the livelihood of the entire community which is at stake, right? So we don't take up that kind of responsibility. So then we came up with this whole, maybe we should try a cooperative model. So we started thinking about governance issues and scalability. So you see, when you go through practically what are problems that are required to be solved, you then start framing it in your mind in theoretical conceptual language. Then over time, you build this vocabulary of stuff, right? So I wouldn't recommend it for a thesis, but I would recommend it for a career, right? For a thesis, do whatever you can in 2.5 years and get the bugger out.
I don't know if others can do it in 2.5 years,
3
Gerry.
years,
That's
okay,
a high
whatever
bar.
it takes.
But, well, so let me ask you this. I mean, it's wonderful to see that you wanted to address problems, and then you almost worked backwards to answer. Okay, you saw the more overarching themes, such as, you know, business models and replication, and then you could write about those things for our journals. So from my point of view now, I see you're a very successful scholar and you had all this work published. For folks who are junior, can you tell us some of the challenges you had along the way? So were the journals, you know, embracing of this kind of problem-driven research that you were first doing, or what were some of the hiccups along the way that now we see as successful scholar, but I think it would give some people, you know, motivation and some drive to hear that from you.
So I have to tell you, over time, the Academy is much more business friendly and phenomenon friendly, but it has not always been the case. Uh, if you look back for 20 years, 30 years of Academy presidents who've been saying that we should be a lot more phenomenon friendly. If you look at Anita's speech, you will see that. You would see others well before her, 10 years and so forth, or on people giving um, their Academy presidency speeches of why the Academy should matter more and that our theoretical focus is probably taking us in the wrong way. Um, but I think it's the challenge is we still need the theoretical focus because the theory is the one that continues from one paper to the other. It's the thread that holds it together. It's not the phenomenon that holds it together, right? So we still need that theory. The question is the difficulty of how you marry both the phenomenon while you are true to the theory, right? So I was actually pretty good in theory because I didn't have any data, so I had to make up stuff and write stuff, right? So um, I did that early on. If you look at my early papers, um, most of them were conceptual papers, so one of my other colleagues was doing his PhD. He got the data from his work on. He wanted to see salespeople and commitment, and I say, hey, you know, these OB folks never actually measure performance. So can we see if commitment is related to performance? And that's pretty much it, right? So I wrote an AMJ with him in 2001. Simply with this idea that commitment leads to performance and that there are different types of commitment. And we could measure that with sales data. For OB folks, it's a stretch because we didn't use any scales. We didn't use any surveys, right? We just measured stuff on secondary data, right? And I wrote it almost like a strategy paper, which upset a lot of OB people. Uh, uh, but you just become creative in the type of work that you do. So people who are starting now, I would say, be intensely practical. Figure out where is it that you can actually um, have some advantage, because you know, ideas are a dime a dozen, right? Everybody's got the same idea. In the past week, I've had at least 5 or 6 people writing to me saying, I'm working on this review on resilience. And I said, you and 20 others at the same time, right? Uh, but it's not on the ideas themselves. It's all on execution, right? When you're junior, the speed of execution matters more than anything else, right? When you're senior, it really doesn't matter, right? Your world moves slower because I have to tell you, my world moves so slow. Uh, because the things that I do, others cannot do, right? So I work with very strong people, and then we sort of say, let's pick topics that we want to write about, and then we do it over time, right? And then with some of my junior colleagues, I write papers that need to move out faster. So you operate on two cycles, time cycles rather than one. But when you're a junior scholar, speed is the only thing that matters. It doesn't really matter. Um, well, it probably matters, but I don't give it that much primacy on what you want to study and so forth. If your advisor has some strength in some area and some data, use it, do it, get out.
Get
Right?
out, get out, get a job that will give you a paycheck. All right.
It also gives you that stability. Then you've got a 6-year clock, right? So you'd want to build up things. Nowadays, people say you have to be in your program for 5-6 years, develop all of these things before you go out. I don't know. That's not my model.
Can I ask you, Gerry, so now you're dean, you've done amazing things at Singapore Management University and specifically with the business school. What would you still like to achieve as dean there?
So I have to say, thank you. So I have to say that I've just announced that I'm going to step down at the end of next June as dean, right? Because it would have been nearly 7 years as dean, and I think that's enough time. It's also because I think whatever I was asked to do, I've delivered. So now I need a different kind of challenge. And for me, I've got heroes like Anita or who are great academics who don't have to be dean. So I think I'm going to be an academic for some time and not be a dean for some time. And part of that is so when you become dean, um, you've run a business, right? You're an entrepreneur. So uh, so when I sort of took over as dean of the business school here, um, our revenues were exactly $87 million. And now it's about $140 million. And how do you do that? You expand programs. It's because you're an entrepreneurship scholar, and you're very much, I'm very much an entrepreneurship guy. You have to start thinking about growth as a way for you to become better. It's very difficult when you're standing still to become better because you don't have degrees of freedom. I've written a paper on Slack before, uh, right? And only when you have Slack are you able to invest and grow in different ways, right? So so I knew upfront if we needed this to be a top school, we needed to grow. And so we grew our undergrad program. We've more than doubled our postgrad program. And then about 3-4 years earlier, I started ranking all our programs. So now across all our master's programs, we're in the top 50 in the world. Our exec MBA program is probably the best mainstream program, which is 22 or 23 in the world. And our master's in wealth management, which is a specialist program, is third in the world. So our MBA, all in the top 50. And part of that is there's no secret. You just have to get better faculty. You have to get your faculty to do more interesting things. You have to find ways to connect with industry a lot closer. So now many of the projects that we do, I'm able to access data directly from companies and saying, what are the problems you're working on and how can we help solve that? And then now my collaborators all work with industry using industry data. So that's why it's a 2-cycle speed because you're not going to replicate that data. So I'm going to have a different speed at which I do. So I become lazy, of course. Not lazy, I just get crowded out in terms of attention. But if all you're doing is publicly available data, like most junior scholars, then speed is the only thing that matters because everybody can replicate that data set, right?
So I'm curious and scared to ask you the next question, which is, as dean, are you able to maintain other hobbies or interests that you have? What is,
No, I'm a super boring person. No, no. My hobbies, I think I would say, is watching Korean soaps. I'm really good at it now. Uh, but um, I, I have to say why I watch Korean soaps. It's um, it's beautiful people.
Mhm.
You don't understand the language, so you've got English subtitles, so you don't have to pay that much attention. The music score, the cinematography, and everything is just beautiful. The Koreans do a wonderful job, and there is no storyline. So it really doesn't matter. So you're just watching it with the idea that you would not think of anything about work, right? So I watch maybe 30 minutes to an hour of Korean soap, and it sort of brings me back to like a meditation mode.
Mhm. To just unplug.
Correct. Some people unplug watching music, some people unplug reading something. I watch Netflix and that it does it for me as well. So it's good.
I'm going to try Korean soaps. I haven't tried that, Jerry. Thank you for
The newest one is The King. I would recommend that.
okay. Thanks. I'm so glad you answered the question that I didn't need to ask, which was why Korean soap. So that was great. Uh, so do you have, there's some other fun questions that I wanted to ask before we turn it over to the audience. So one is, do you have any favorite author or genre of books or any specific book that is your favorite?
So what I don't do favorites like that. In fact, I don't get as much time to read. The one that I'm reading now is a book called Popular. It's an interesting book. It's a fellow called Mitch Prinstein, I think, in UNC, and is a psychologist, I think. And he's sort of talks about people get obsessed with status and search for status, and these people are the most unhappy people because status is never enough. Um, but he talks about likability, and he says that those who strive for likability are probably more happy. So I'm trying to think about how I'm implementing his wisdom in my life.
Likability. You're very likable.
Likability,
I can
L-
tell you that for sure. So,
likability versus status effects or status effects. Yes. So
so you
anyway.
mentioned you'll be stepping down as dean next year. What are your plans then? You mentioned you want to be an academic again, not a dean. So what are
Yeah.
some of the things you want to do?
So now is a point where I'm rethinking what it is. I want to connect back to entrepreneurship in a deeper way. I want to connect back to policy. There's a project that I didn't talk to you about which I worked with the WHO and UNAIDS and so forth. I'll come back to that. But those projects had a profound impact on sort of, this idea of how can management academics solve challenges of, the global challenges. So, um, so whatever job I take, whether it's going to be in Singapore, in another sort of, it's not going to be a purely as an academic role. It's going to be a hybrid role. So one option is for me to stay in Singapore, but work with some of the institutions here. The other option is for me to move back to the UK or to the US. I'm a citizen of both, right? And then connect back with policy and entrepreneurship and see if there's meaningful impact in different ways. So, yeah.
Can I ask you, Jerry, where do you see the field of strategy and entrepreneurship intellectually in 5 years? So what do you think will be our greatest challenges in both kind of theory and empirical work?
So I'm not smart enough to answer that one, right? You need much more brain power for that, and I'm not even sure how you can call sort of the strategy. I think I can call strategy more than I can call entrepreneurship, honestly. In strategy as a field, I think we would have lots of new methods,
Mm.
and I think we will be revisiting some of the older questions with completely new methods and come to different answers, right? Um, I think we will question this idea of performance as an outcome and this idea that uh, stakeholders matter in different ways and how does that profoundly shape strategic decisions and governance and partnerships and so forth. And I think there is there is something there that will become more prominent over time. We have these words of shareholder value, then we had sort of shared value, and so now we'll have different words that will emerge over time as the world itself figures out that it does need to do a better job of managing its stakeholders, and this notion of shareholder primacy will evolve, and that will evolve based on the institutional environment evolving around us. So I know in strategy, our language will change, our focus on performance will change. We will have new tools and methods to think about it. We will start, I hope, obsessing less about endogeneity concerns and more about um, uh, identifying the real problems, right? Instead of trying to identify the methodological issues, try to identify the real problems and solve that, right? So, and I think we'll see a lot more traction in that those spaces. In entrepreneurship as a field, um, there's a lot happening in entrepreneurship, but I'm not sure that it has a single organizing rubric as strategy has, right? And so what has happened in entrepreneurship is that there are multiple parallel conversations on, for example, who becomes an entrepreneur, roles of an entrepreneur, and entrepreneurship within the ecosystem and so forth, right? So there are multiple conversations that are happening there. And I think each of those strands will have value. What I don't know is whether there will be a unification on any of these areas, right? Or one will stand out as being more prominent. But entrepreneurship will, has become mainstream because of the sheer size of its membership. There are a lot of smart people doing entrepreneurship work. Where we'll have to see is the formalization of some of those theories, the adoption of shared language in those theories, and possibly the adoption of new methods within those.
Thank you. Thank you, Gerry.
Maybe it's the wrong answer. I don't even know.
No, that was very informative. I love what you said about, you know, we may have different methods now and we may come to different answers about a lot of the questions that we've been asking in the past. So
correct. So take COVID, for example. We have this social construction of input-output combinations, right? So we believed that we have to have face-to-face teaching for a good experience. Some of that has been challenged more recently, right? I have to tell you, I developed one immersive online learning class on a new platform, and I always do well in class. On a 7 scale, I usually do about 6.5, 6.6 on a 7, but my online class is 6.9 on a 7. I don't think I can beat that, right? So, you know. Maybe there are different ways of achieving what we want to achieve. So for us, we'll start questioning these social constructions of what is an input-output combination, right? We thought we needed to be physically present to collaborate with each other. Maybe not, right?
Definitely, I think just even all of the things we've been doing, our outreach, and again, what technology has made feasible is, you know, unprecedented, right?
Correct.
That we have now. All right, thank you so much, Gerry. I really want to include all the participants before I open the floor up for questions. And I'm going to ask folks if you could raise your hand in either through the Zoom mechanism of reactions, or you could just put a note in the chat that you'd like to ask Gerry a question. I would first like to take a screenshot though, and this is for our publicity and branding. I've been told by our communications director, Paolo, that I need to do this. So if you feel comfortable showing your video, that would be great. If not, then it's fine if you don't. But if everyone could join us who would like to, then I'll tell you when to look at your screen and to smile. All right, how's that? right, hold on one second. Let me make sure I do this right. All right. Ready? Everybody look and smile. 1, 2, 3, cheese. All right, I think I got a good picture. That's great. Thank you, everybody. And so now I'll open the floor up for questions. Let me just make sure I have my chat feed open. I'd closed it to take the picture. So 1 second. All right. All right, so folks who have questions, if you could use I think it's the fastest ways for me to just see people raising their hand. I think that would be the easiest way. Questions for Gerry. You learned so much. I know going first sometimes is daunting. Anita, go for it.
Thank you so much for this wonderful experience of getting to know you even a little bit better after so many decades of friendship. Can you say a little bit about what you think is happening with COVID right now and what it may mean for entrepreneurship and strategy in practice and in scholarship?
So, so if you look at COVID itself, it challenges some of our assumptions, right? And so I'm working on this sort of editorial for JMS. They had asked me on how is it going to change innovation research. And so there are a couple of assumptions that we take for granted in our research. One is co-location, or geographic proximity. We talk about social effects, that we have to have social connections for something to work. The discussion that we had earlier on input-output combinations, we assume that you need certain things as a necessity before we do some other things. And so these questions, these assumptions get relaxed. So when these assumptions get relaxed, then you sort of say, how will this change our research and innovation or entrepreneurship? For example, you talk about theories of collaboration, coordination, and collaboration. Would we have different views of the outcomes of coordination if we didn't have physical closeness? And would we have different patterns if we thought about it that way? Then the role of technology as enablers. We know video conferencing, but you also get new technologies that are completely different. We talk about AI issues and machine learning and many of these instances, but the new technologies are starting for us to sort of shape some of these conditions for us to work together or perhaps redefining what we think of as creating value. COVID also has changed the way we think of what is important in terms of outcome and its effects, because the pandemic's implications are, it affects social inclusion in a far more profound way. For example, I'll give you from my experience, we said all our exams are online, right? And I'm sure all of you did the same thing as well. But when we did that, only the dean can exempt students from writing exams if they're not online to come back to campus. So I got these emails from kids, from students, saying that, you know, we are 7 members in our family and we are in a 2-bedroom flat. I cannot write an exam from my apartment. I just cannot do it. Right? We forget that there are folks in this world who are barely scraping by, and events like these make a massive disruption in their whole world, right? I've had students who are couple of students who one's dad is a plumber and his mom's a cleaner, And when they talk about, I cannot do classes online simply because I don't have the reliable connection that you assume that all Singaporeans have, right? So the outcomes of that is felt disproportionately, right? The same thing we talk about gender. I know in the US you're talking about race quite a bit nowadays, but you talk about gender, right? Um, think about junior faculty who are putting up their promotion packages for next year, completely gone haywire, right? Because they're not getting their reviews back on time. Their life is being disrupted because they have to, in a very male-dominated society, they also have to care for their kids. Some of them also have to care for older parents. So the effects of these outcomes are far more different, right? So you have to say when an event happens like this, who benefits and who loses, right? There's a Latin saying, word called cui bono, means, yeah, who gets the value out of it? So when you think of innovation research and innovation entrepreneurship outcomes, some entrepreneurs will benefit because they are either figured out a better business model, they've been able to adapt, they're more resilient. You can have these different words for it, but others lose out completely. So we have to start asking these questions on what gets disrupted, what was the causal mechanism, the assumption that gets relaxed, and what are the contingencies? How did this make a difference, right? I was having this conversation. I'm working with one of the banks here. We are analyzing all their data on credit decisions. And what we're finding now is that what happened with COVID is that those that had weak social capital are unable to sustain through this crisis. So what does weak social capital mean? That means you've created boards that are not connected. And typically, these are in racial or ethnic groups that are not the mainstream groups, right? So then you start asking very different questions. Is that if you want to improve policy effectiveness, you shouldn't be targeting more broadly, but you should be much more specific in how you target these SMEs, right? So I'm sure there'll be plenty of these questions, but I think it comes down to assumptions. What assumptions have we relaxed? Who benefits? Who does it disproportionately affect in terms of outcomes? And what were the new contingencies that sort of came up with, and what has changed within this? And I think this will fuel plenty of questions over the coming years.
Thank you, Gerry.
There's one person in chat asking a question.
Yes, we have several other questions in the chat. Some are sending them to me privately. So maybe I can first ask Jing, if you could unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hello, Professor Gerry. I am Jing, first year PhD student in Purdue University in strategic management field. Actually, I have just one follow-up question because you mentioned like you're saying there are some new methods that can be applied to this field. Probably will revise some important questions previously we analyzed, right? So I am wondering what are those new methods that can be applied? Can you give examples? Yeah.
So clearly you've not read my AMJ editorial on data science methods.
Oh, sorry for that.
So if you look at it, there was a 2016 editorial on new data science methods and asking new answers for old questions. And there's a whole section on how you can revisit some of our assumptions with new methods, right? So one of the papers that I'm working on now is revisiting this whole idea on patents, and with a co-author of mine, Simon Shilabix. We are using sort of semantic language, so natural language processing on patent data to see whether emerging hotspots based on language and how firms position themselves near these new hotspots benefit firms. And what we find is that not all firms benefit by just chasing after the new hot language, right? There are certain types of firms that benefit, and we just call them generalist and specialist and breadth and depth and things like that. But essentially, we're going back after these sort of old questions that sort of says, when there's a new technology, who's the one likely to benefit from adopting new technologies? Except we are doing it in completely different ways than what we used to do before.
Thanks.
Gerry, there's a question from Asim.
Gerry, that was fascinating. You know, I was hoping to hear a little bit more, and I know you mentioned you never actually got around to talking more about it, but the WHO collaboration.
Oh, great.
But I think more generally, you know, just as someone who's done a lot of work working with policymakers, trying to actually make change happen in the real world as opposed to studying it academically, like what is that like? What are the challenges? What are the sort of benefits or joys of that that you've experienced?
First, I have to say it's very difficult working with multilateral institutions because they are massive bodies. They're not like one person things, right? It's not like a CEO who has control over a firm and you go to the CEO and it all works. In fact, the head of WHO probably can't control what goes on in the different parts within it, right? That's how these multilateral bodies work. But the project that I started was, I was having this breakfast meeting with one of the medics at the university. And that time he was the head of, he was the director of the UNAIDS Gates Foundation. They had this program together for the prevention of mother-to-child transmission of HIV. So, and he started with a simple phenomenon, and I was saying, he was asking me, can you help explain why this is the case? And the phenomenon was, started off with India as an example, that a child being born to a mother who has HIV, if the mother has a particular tablet at the time of birth and within 24 hours before she starts breastfeeding, then the likelihood that the child contracts HIV is reduced significantly by like 70–80%, right? Why? Because HIV does not pass through placenta, but it passes through colostrum, the breast milk, right? So, and you know, in most countries, developing countries, mothers breastfeed their children, and it's seen as taboo if you are not breastfeeding your child, right? Because your mother-in-law will start questioning you and saying, "Oh, why are you not doing that?" Because the woman has probably not told the mother-in-law that it was your son who was naughty and who slept with, you know, a prostitute on the way that he's driving a truck, and then comes back to the village and gives the HIV to me, and now I'm having a baby. Because if she tells the mother-in-law, she's going to get chased out of the house, right? Because that's how that world works. So now the question then becomes, what are the organizational failures that happen that could have been mitigated by giving that mother, that child, without anybody else, giving that mother the medicine without anybody else knowing in their family, right? So this goes into all sorts of management theories, right? You talk about information disclosure, asymmetry. You know, I don't consider myself to be an OB guy or a strategy guy. I just go and talk to people and they'll explain a problem to me, and then I'll figure out what lens you want to adopt so you never go. My first lesson to engaging public policy or even business is never go with a lens, just go to understand the problem, and then you adopt the lens from there, right? So that was what happened, is that then you start asking these questions of institutional failures in information sharing, right? So between very simple things like the woman goes, in India, for example, the woman goes from the husband's house to her mother's house to have the baby, right? And typically they're not in the same village. So what happens is that one village that has been following her loses track of the patient because she goes to have a baby somewhere else. And they don't have the foresight to actually give the medicine to her when she comes the first time around. So you see, so then the woman gets lost to the system, and they call it lost to follow-up, right? There's a technical term for, oh, we just don't know we're lost to follow-up. So this is a simple example of a coordination failure within an organization, because if it's the next neighboring village, it's very easy because you're within the same district system anyways. You should have known, right? You should be able to transfer that knowledge, but we don't. So then you start asking, okay, that's on the institutional side. But then you also think of, now you talk about COVID virus and the lack of PPE and all of this stuff. This is the same stuff that happens everywhere in the world, right? So nurses don't have that medicine to give the patient that medicine when they come. The doctors don't show up at the time the patients come. And so what happens is that you've got failures in the system in terms of the institution. You've got failures at sort of at the practice level. And then you've got individuals stepping up like magnanimously. In fact, right, we call these extra role behaviors, right? Individuals who step up to address these shortcomings, right? And that's how. So now we are working on this paper on dirty work and organizational failures in dirty work settings, right? So if you're caring for HIV patients, it's stigmatized. So when stigma happens, coordination fails because communication fails. Then what we are looking at, the study is about how individuals step up to bridge that communication failure. Seems like a very simple study, but if you look at what's happening with COVID, I don't know if it was in the US, but I know in the UK, people were saying that nurses didn't have PPE, there was no protective equipment, and so they had to step up when the institution had failed in some ways, right? The lack of coordination, all of these things. So you just figure out, okay, how do you go in, understand the problem, and then you figure out some solutions around it. So the solutions we came up with were, how do you incentivize community level workers to step up? How do you get them information? Simple things like giving them a cheap cell phone so that they can text to say that somebody is leaving and that they can communicate with the patient. And then to coordinate by SMS, things that we do in daily life, but can you have a healthcare system that's sort of failing and you can substitute some of these personal ways of coordination to substitute for institutional failures in communication. And it works. So we made that report. I presented that in those findings before the WHO in Geneva. Those results were adopted. And now all my recommendations from the panel have been adopted in India and 6 other countries. So the real impact is, if you feel that some kids are born without HIV, that's good. You used your smarts in some useful way. That's it. I still haven't published that paper, by the way. It's taken me 7 years. So I'll get it out. I'll get it out. Because I'm the junior co-author on that paper. Just think of who my senior co-authors are.
Gerry, there's a question from Sukun Kang.
Hi, Gerry and others. I'm Sukun from LBS. So I resonate with your, big challenge and how you are trying to tackle this problem. So I have a project on similar field. I'm working on a project on expanded access. You may have heard of it because of the COVID. It's about providing access to the investigation drug, and it's really up to pharma's decision to do that. From the patients and healthcare perspective, this is definitely very important. We're like, why don't you do it? You are you a bad pharma? You gotta do it. And so I was kind of stuck in that mindset, right? And I gathered the data, and I was collecting data, and I got a chance to talk to pharma personnel, and it kind of hit my head. They were like, oh, we really want to do it, but it's just that limited resources. We are doing this clinical trials here. How can we provide an access to investigative drug in the other country and so on? So then I realized that, I was just looking at just one dimension. of this phenomenon, and even theoretically, right? So what's your like take on like how, as a PhD student, right? I'm obviously have a far way to go, and if I start taking everybody's perspective, and it's really hard to pin down a problem, I think. So is it better for me to kind of take a one side's perspective and try to theorize and tackle a research question that, or do I need a holistic perspective? It's a tough question, I think.
So no, in fact, it's an easy question. The answer is relatively easy. Think about it this way. None of the questions we're asking now is holistic anyways, right? If you take a philosophical position that we measure only what we see, that means there are a lot of things that we don't see, right? So for you, I would say, take the first question that you have the data for that could give you the most comprehensive answer that you can possibly get at this time. That's it. So if it's one perspective in terms of pharma data, then use just that. But in your discussion, you should leave these crumbs where you can then pick up later, where you sort of say, you know, I've taken this as a pharmaceutical example, and but the perspective may have a different implication if you look at it from another perspective, right? One thing I do know is, and it's been amazing as a journey, is that everybody wants to do good, whether it's a pharmaceutical firm, whether it's an oil company, they want to do what is the right thing. I think people in leadership want to do the right thing. What they are constrained about are either their business model, how can we reach, for example, access issues, you know, whether it's geographic reach or social reach. We need the last mile, but I can't get to the last mile. I'm not sure how to do it, right? Or business model typically gets reflected in, it's too expensive to do something this way, and therefore we don't do it. But if somebody wants to do it, we are happy to support it. So I think everybody has good intentions. So when you study something, especially when it has a social impact, you have to be open to the fact that even though you may go in thinking pharma is all bad, you may be surprised that the answer that you come up with would be far different from what you went in with, right? So being open about it, open-minded about it, is very important. And whatever question we ask is, you're going to be as comprehensive for the data you have, right? And you can answer only what data you have. And then you can build a career out of it. Expanded access is a topic that's not going to go away for the next 30 years. So if you made your entire life on improving access, you would have done well.
Thank you, Gerry. That was very helpful.
Gerry, there's a question from Angel Sharma.
Hi, Gerry. So, hi everyone, I'm Angel from UNSW in Sydney. I'm in my second year of my PhD. I was speaking to my supervisor about a few weeks ago, and he said it took him about 10 years to actually master the art of publishing in top journals, the likes of AMJ and SMJ. And me sitting there as a PhD student, I was thinking, geez, this is a long time. So I was just wondering what your tips would be for people like us on how to get ahead, because we have to run quick and fast, especially if you want to land jobs in those good business schools. Thank you.
So where your supervisor is right is that there is, I'm not sure mastery is the word, but I think there are significant efficiencies over time on how you write. Right? So if I want to write now, I don't think it's that difficult for me to write a paper, right? And I don't write a section 10 times as I used to, right? I write it once and maybe go and edit it again, and that's it, right? So there are significant efficiencies. So the way that I would always say is that in your first few papers, collaborate, work with others, work with folks who've done this before, who know how to frame issues. There are certain things in a paper that are important you know, framing in terms of making sure that you ask the right question and articulating a contribution in an interesting way. I think that comes with experience. So if you can collaborate with somebody early on, I think that's the best way to do it. In fact, I interviewed one finance colleague. We've just hired her. And, you know, for years, she was working on 2 single-author Journal of Finance papers. They both were accepted. But she hadn't published anything for 6 years. And because of that, she had to move 2 institutions, you see. She didn't get through midterm review in her first institution, and the second institution didn't want to take the risk because it was already, what, 6-7 years since she's graduated. So I've just hired her, and she's gotten 2 Journal of Finance papers, right? But both single author. And I asked her, what was the decision you made that she said, that was the worst decision that I made, thinking that I could do this paper by myself. Because if I had gotten the paper with a more experienced co-author earlier, I would have gotten this paper done, right? And in the interim, she also had 3 kids, right? So this is life, right? So you can't be, I know some people are superwomen, but and supermen, but not everybody is. So right, so you just have to mitigate your shortfalls by using partnerships.
Thank you.
Gerry, there's a question from Miranda Elizar.
Hi, I really appreciate everything you said, especially talking about your time at AMJ and studying phenomena and theory. Having submitted papers to AMJ and gotten a common comment of you don't have enough contribution, or I don't know if you will have enough contribution after you do your R&R, those type of things. Do you have any advice, especially if you do have a good, interesting phenomena, and that might be where you start, but you're kind of thinking about the theory at the same time and trying to make them both go together in a way that they'll accept?
So AMJ is a tough journal simply because, you know, people self-select before sending it to AMJ, and, you know, 6% of the papers get in after that self-selection, right? So you're looking at competing with 1,500 other papers. So I'll tell you what I thought of when I was an editor. So I'll tell you my schedule. I wake up 5:30 every morning, and by 7 o'clock, I would have written 5 decision letters, right? And then I'll go and be dean, right? Because that has its fair share of other rubbish. So if you think about it, then you get about maximum 30 minutes of attention. So how do you convey something interesting, something counterintuitive in that 30 minutes, right? So if I get 7 papers or 8 papers, I would desk reject between 3 or 4 papers. And then I would write those letters that same morning when I read them, right? And so a desk reject usually conveys your contribution. It's an interesting problem, but you're not talking about it enough, right? And that's typically what. And what does that mean? When I think about it, it doesn't have that, wow, that's cool, right? It doesn't frame a question in a way that makes you think about it, right? So another way of saying this is, if I asked the same question to 5 different people, would they give me the answer that you found, right? If only one of them gave that same answer that you found, and 2 or 3 of them said, well, I don't know what the answer is, that's an interesting question. If it is kind of intuitive that that's the answer that you're going to give, you're not going to go into AMJ. So if you've got a study, just frame the question and ask 5 different people who you know. And if they come up with your answer, then write the paper differently.
Okay, thank you.
There's a question from Michael Holmes.
Oh, Michael.
Hey, Gerry, this has been great. Thank you for doing this, and thank you for staying up until 11 p.m. On our behalf. There's several people on this call, I think, who have volunteered in organizations like the Academy or SMS or similar organizations. And I was wondering just about the role that those organizations help play in your career. And what would you say maybe to junior scholars who are thinking about volunteering, with some of those organizations or, the journals or whatever? And I just wonder, how important was that to your career, and what ways did that influence your career? And what would you say to maybe junior scholars who are looking into that?
I'll give you a different analogy. If you move to a different country, the best way to make friends is through your take them to your kid's school, and you'll meet other parents. It's the same way, right? That the Academy, the Strategic Management Society, all of these professional organizations are ways for you to make friends without feeling awkward, right? And so the way that I would say it is just go and do small things. I started off with in the entrepreneurship division, my first job was welcoming newbies into the Academy. I think, I don't know what it was called, but it's like newbies into the Academy, right? Making sure that they could register and things like that. I'm sure we do that thing now as well. Then slowly it went into research committee, and then something into awards committee. Slowly you just expand the number of things that you do. And while you're talking to friends and so forth, you meet others and they'll say, hey, can I review for, let's say, an AMJ? The only way you're going to get noticed by AMJ is if you go and ask them, right? There are too many good people around the Academy that you do not deserve to be asked. Some people would say, oh, I'm so good, I deserve to be. No, nobody deserves to be asked. If not you, there's some other bloke, right? So the only way that you get these opportunities is to put yourself out there, not in terms of like Uber networking, and some people do that. I get annoyed when people only read my card and then read my name and then talk to me. It's the same way, right? You go to the Academy to make friends and build a network. I wouldn't have met Chakra Zara had I not sat in the last table of a conference where all of us were trying to get out. I'm sure many Academy sessions are like that as well. So, right, you just have to be there. Volunteer. Being invited to AMJ Associate Editor was because I did a good job reviewing for AMJ. And AMJ tracks every review that you do, how timely it is. It calculates a score of how many days you took and how the editor rated your review. And you build that over years of time. And then if you're consistent in what you do and you really care, it'll show. And when they call out for associate editors, we just take the top 40, 50 of these reviewer scores and then go through one by one and then build a team, right? So that's how it happens. It doesn't happen magically because I did not know Jason Colquitt because he was an OB guy, very nice guy, who was in University of Georgia, right? And I'm in London Business School. These are not connected institutions, but the only thing that connects is your sort of history of consistent effort. And people know, you get a reputation of, if you're a bit of a chaser or social climber or something like that, people will also know that, right? So be genuine in your attempts, really feel like you want to improve the community, and the community will give back to you in more ways. I've benefited immensely from the Academy, more so than I've ever given it. I've given a lot to AMJ, but I've benefited a lot more than that.
That's awesome. Thank you. Thank you for being so frank as well.
Gerry, I'm curious, you mentioned you have 2 daughters. Are either of them pursuing academia by chance?
I think they're traumatized looking at my work schedule. But my elder daughter, she finished undergrad in economics at LSE. And then she did design thinking in Royal College of Art. Now she works in McKinsey. So I gave her my Africa data for a study and she's published a paper on women and rural electrification, on how distance matters, that women are the ones who are on the outskirts of villages, especially if they've lost their husbands, and it disproportionately affects them. She looked at that data and she found it out herself, because I wasn't looking at gender as a specific topic, but she was. And then we published it together. So, but no, she does not want to do it. She wants to be in McKinsey.
But you influenced her. She's doing research, right? I mean, even while at McKinsey. So that's wonderful. I needed to ask you because none of my kids are entering academia, they've told me. So I think I have traumatized them somehow. I'm not sure. Well, thank you so much for being so candid and giving us, yes, applause. Staying up late, I think it's safe to say we're going to let you go 20 minutes early because it's late and you've given us a lot of your time. But I think we're all very thankful. And thank you for being the first scholar that STR was able to interview.
Hopefully it wasn't too boring.
No, oh goodness, you couldn't be boring if you tried.
It was super awesome.
Super awesome.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Shamina. Thank you, everybody.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night. Thank you, Gerry, so much.
Thank you. Bye.